November 25th, 2004. It's Thanksgiving Day in San Francisco, California, one of the most beautiful cities in America.
There are lots of different cultural experiences that you can have.
You see an amazing food scene, a lot of beautiful architecture, a lot of local attractions, and there's a lot of money in the Bay Area.
And all that wealth comes at a price.
San Francisco is one of the most expensive cities in the country.
With the price of housing and everything else growing more and more unaffordable, people are leaving San Francisco.
Lots of families opt to live in Oakland, which is significantly less expensive.
What Brooklyn is to Manhattan, Oakland is to San Francisco. There's a bridge that separates the two. And many people who live in Oakland have roots and family in San Francisco.
When Linda Alonzo's family sits down for Thanksgiving dinner that evening in San Francisco,
I'm gonna try calling Linda again.
they're still waiting for her to arrive from her home across the bay in Oakland.
When they tried to reach out to her, there was no response. So they were kind of wondering what was going on.
You reached Linda. I'm unavailable. Leave a message and I'll get right back with you.
Linda, honey.
The turkey's out of the oven.
Eventually, the family carries on without her.
Maybe there was traffic. The Bay Bridge often has a lot of traffic, especially on a holiday.
But by the time they're finished eating, she still hasn't arrived.
Leave a message and I'll get right back with you.
Linda, call me when you get this. I saved your plate.
Hours go by. No sign of Linda. No phone call.
At that point, the family knew something was seriously wrong.
"48-year-old Cynthia Linda Alonzo spent most of her early years in San Francisco.
She grew up in a very close-knit family. They always called her by her middle name, Linda.
Linda came up from more of a hard-scrabble life.
Linda grew up in a part of town that could be considered lower income, and her family really struggled.
But she had a family that loved her, a family that she spent a lot of time with.
They supported each other emotionally if they couldn't support each other financially.
And by the time Linda turned 30, she had her own family to support.
She had 5 children, and that really meant the world to her.
However, none of the children's fathers were really in their life.
Which is one reason why the single mother eventually left San Francisco behind, moving across the Bay Bridge to nearby Oakland.
This is actually extremely common, especially for people who were born around the time Linda was in the mid-50s. In San Francisco, we had a huge amount of Black displacement due to a redevelopment.
She ultimately found herself living here in Oakland because it's cheaper to live and there's a larger base of Black and working class people.
She was really looking forward to creating a different life for herself, a stable life, a better life.
Although it wasn't until Linda was in her 40s that things really started looking up for the single mom.
Her 5 children were getting older, and they were starting to do their own thing. Linda was finally able to spend a little time on herself.
She was optimistic. She was hopeful. She wanted a storybook romance.
Then she met Eric Mora.
Eric was a smart guy, handsome guy, well-educated, by all accounts, extremely charming.
Eric, in contrast to Linda, grew up in the lap of luxury. He received a large inheritance, which allowed him to afford a lifestyle that Linda could only imagine. Nice housing, fancy cars.
Given Linda's circumstances, it must have been amazing to meet this guy that was able to take her out and show her another side of life.
And it only got better from there.
Wait, is this your place?
Yeah, you got to see it from the balcony.
Eric lived in a beautiful house that he owned in one of the Bay Area's most affluent neighborhoods, the Oakland Hills.
It's a beautiful area where most people would like to live because you get some nice views.
How'd you like it?
You kidding me? This place is gorgeous.
This must have seemed almost like a fairy tale situation. That this great guy with this beautiful house and all of these things going for him was interested in her.
They say opposites attract. This was that situation. Despite the difference between the way in which they grew up, they somehow found love together.
Not only had Linda found love, she'd also found the better life she'd been looking for ever since she moved to Oakland.
He was able to provide her with things that she had only dreamed about.
The couple grew even closer as Linda's kids grew up and left home.
She became a fixture in his life, and he became a fixture in hers.
Now, both of them are in their late 40s, which a lot of people might think is a hard time to meet someone and fall in love. So I'm sure it felt great to have love at that point in your life where a lot of people have already been established.
But now, just as it seemed Linda had so much to look forward to, she is a no-show for Thanksgiving dinner at her mother's house in San Francisco.
This is totally not normal for her to not show up to Thanksgiving dinner and also not call.
She also wasn't answering her phone.
Linda, please call me when you get this.
As the family's concern for Linda is growing, they decide to reach out to Eric.
When they got a hold of Eric,
Hello?
He seemed just as puzzled as they were about her disappearance.
What do you mean she didn't show up?
He said he hadn't seen her, and that was surprising to them.
But it's what he says next that's even more surprising.
To be honest, I haven't seen her in days.
This night's been so amazing.
When she met Eric Mora, Linda Alonso had finally found the love and support she'd always craved.
She spent most of her adult life as a struggling mother trying to get by.
When you are used to going without, that just creates that yearning so much more deeply in you.
He could provide for her and her family in a way that I'm not sure other people could have.
But now, she's missed her family's traditional Thanksgiving dinner, leaving them concerned that something is wrong.
This is someone who talks to her family on the phone every day.
Yeah?
When the family got a hold of Eric, he stated that he had not seen or heard from Linda.
To be honest, I haven't seen her in days.
He said he last seen Linda on Saturday when she came over to his house for dinner.
You think something happened to her?
I don't know.
But if you see her, please keep a call.
Yeah, of course.
On the phone, Eric seemed just as worried as Linda's family.
By the next morning, with still no word from Linda, the family decides to report her missing to the Oakland police.
The family had to go down to the police station and provide all the information they could. Pictures of Linda, who she's been with, and the last person that they knew had seen her, which was Eric.
The boyfriend.
Yes.
Was there any trouble there?
No, not at all.
However, the family also admits that things hadn't always been great for Linda.
The family ultimately had to explain Linda's background.
Linda's life wasn't always easy. She had times of trouble financially, times of trouble in terms of stability of housing.
And it wasn't just because San Francisco had gotten too expensive.
The family revealed that in the past, Linda had issues with substance abuse.
Okay, when you say substance abuse, what do you mean?
Crack. She smoked crack.
When we talk about substance use disorder, we're talking about a physical and a psychological addiction. And when we're talking about crack cocaine, we're talking about the addiction in its most powerful, most terrifying force.
According to the family, Linda had beaten the odds and kicked her habit.
Linda was able to build her life back up, start a relationship, things that for her were an enormous triumph.
But was that triumph only temporary?
What the family was concerned about is there was still the possibility that she may have relapsed.
When you have a family member that struggles with substance abuse, that's always going to be a question.
We're going to do everything in our power to find out what happened to Linda.
You ladies.
After talking to Linda's family, detectives launch a missing persons investigation.
The Oakland police follow up on the information that the family provided. One of the first things they did was to go to Linda's house in order to investigate and search the house for any type of clues that might lead them to her whereabouts.
When the landlord lets them in, everything appears normal.
They didn't see any signs that there had been any sort of incident in the space, no signs of forced entry, no signs that Linda had been pulled from her house.
It was like she had left home.
Her backpack that she usually took with her was gone.
From their search, police are leaving with no real clues as to what happened to Linda or where she might be at.
Nothing.
The house an apparent dead end. Detectives ask Eric to come in for a statement.
The police turn to who the police always turn to first, which is the significant other of the person who is missing.
Eric shows up to the police department, willingly participates in the interview.
So, did you find anything out about Linda? I'm afraid not.
Eric Mora seems to be very concerned and worried about his girlfriend.
But as detectives question him, they can't help but notice something.
He had what it seemed to be fresh scratches on his hands.
That heightened that level of suspicion.
So what happened there?
I've been sanding the floors of my house. I should have hired someone.
It seems reasonable.
Still, detectives are suspicious.
But at the same time, Eric seemed to be willing to cooperate with the investigation.
He talks to investigators at length about he and Linda's relationship, tells the police intimate details.
I was afraid something like this was going to happen. What do you mean?
He tells them that, he and Linda were in love, but that in recent times, that love has had to face some serious challenges because Linda has backslid into a lifestyle that he thought that she had left behind.
He said that she had started using crack again.
A relapse is exactly what Linda's family had feared.
I tried to get her to go to rehab, but it was hard.
It's a painful process because it leaves your loved ones feeling helpless.
However, according to Eric, the crack isn't all he's worried about.
And the stuff she's been doing, it's scary.
Stuff? Like other drugs?
No, it's not that. I told her I wouldn't give her any more money.
According to Eric, she found another way to feed her addiction.
He said she was a prostitute.
Linda Alonzo's boyfriend, Eric Mora, hasn't just confirmed her family's fear that the former addict is using again. He informs detectives the situation is even worse than they imagined.
He said that to pay for that addiction, she had started doing sex work.
He was trying to stop her from selling her body, but she wouldn't stop.
He also says that Linda kept her relapse and how she was funding it a secret from her family.
The secrecy is common because there's a lot of guilt and shame for the person that's struggling with the addiction.
Eric's news of just how far Linda has relapsed adds a new layer of urgency to the missing persons investigation.
It's not unusual for prostitutes and addicts to become victims of foul play.
She could have gone off into an underworld of drug addiction to never be seen again.
When did you see Linda last? Saturday morning. Please, is there anything I can do, to keep you here?
I'm going.
He told the police that he had given her $40 and dropped her off in West Oakland.
I knew I shouldn't have given her that money, but I didn't know what else to do.
He knew full and well that she was going to use that money to beat this addiction that had a grip on her life. But he had so much love for her, he was hopeful that by him giving her that money, she wouldn't have to go and sell herself.
When you're in a long-term romantic relationship with someone and they relapse back into addiction, it feels so painful. You feel helpless. You're worried about enabling them, but what you really don't want is for them to be in unsafe situations. And so it makes sense that you may want to reduce the risk by providing the resource that the person needs if they're going to do it anyway.
I thought she'd be back in a day or two.
Eric told detectives that Linda had disappeared like this before.
But she had always come back.
And despite her addiction, he's continued to remain by her side, but yet understood that the addiction had complete control of her.
I thought I was helping.
He was just trying to be her crutch in this moment.
Whenever a person is enabling a loved one, it's because they love them and they're really doing what they think is best to support them.
Now detectives wonder whether Eric's misguided attempt to keep Linda safe had led to her disappearance. Or worse.
West Oakland definitely has far more crime, far more street crime, far more violent crime.
There's some areas that have what we call the projects. And over there, because of the poverty and the lack of opportunities, you get a lot of drug trafficking. And drug trafficking brings in robberies, and robbery brings in assaults.
That's all we have for you. You're free to go.
You can follow me.
After detectives talk to Eric, the search for Linda takes the police to the streets.
It put out an APB for officers to be on the lookout for her.
Oakland PD broadened the scope of their investigation. They start using their resources, patrol officers, patrolling up and down streets where prostitution is known to occur, beating the streets for all the information they can, looking for leads.
Hi, yes. Do you have a...
Detectives also check with area hospitals and jails.
There was still a possibility that she overdosed, or she could have been picked up for drugs or prostitution.
Unfortunately, the police learned nothing. Despite all the efforts, no one has seen Linda. Linda has seemingly disappeared without a trace.
Or is it possible that she's in hiding?
Sometimes somebody doesn't want to be found because they are somewhere doing drugs, because they are with someone who is paying them for sex work or other work, because they have re-entered a life that they had left and they're ashamed and they don't want their family or friends to know. And I am sure that all of these things crossed the police officer's mind.
Empty-handed so far, detectives reach out to Linda's circle of Oakland friends.
These were people who didn't necessarily know or communicate with Linda's family in San Francisco.
They are surprised to learn that the story that Eric has is something totally different than the story that her friends have to share.
None of Linda's friends say they ever saw signs of a drug relapse.
No.
And that isn't the only contradiction to Eric's story.
Friends of Linda's believe that Eric might not be as perfect as he seemed initially.
They share with investigators that, yes, the relationship between Linda and Eric started off as a fairy tale, but at some point in time, turned into more of a nightmare.
Wait, so it wasn't drugs?
No, not at all. It was Eric.
Nothing wrong with me going out with my friends. Yes, I am.
They start to get more details on their relationship and that their relationship was not good.
According to what Linda told her friends, Eric had become controlling and jealous.
He acted like he owned her.
But that wasn't the worst of it.
She was saying that she was not sure if she felt safe around Eric.
Really? She told me that he would sometimes hit her.
A friend of Linda Alonzo has just told detectives investigating her disappearance a very different story than the one they got from the missing woman's boyfriend, Eric Mora.
He acted like he owned her.
Before her disappearance, Linda told her friends about wanting to leave Eric and that their relationship was not good and, in fact, abusive.
In his statement to police, Eric had told detectives that Linda, a former addict, had a recent relapse.
Eric's statement fit with what Linda's family told them about her past.
The family had to be very frank and honest and disclose to the police about her history of drug abuse.
But now, detectives wonder if Eric had been counting on that.
It sounds like some of those vulnerabilities are what was leveraged by Eric.
The fact that Linda had not told her family about the abuse is not all that uncommon.
Something that is seen in a lot of cases involving domestic abuse is that the victim will tell kind of random people like their neighbors, but they won't tell their immediate family.
You don't want their judgment. You don't want them to echo what you're already saying to yourself. It can feel disheartening and absolutely demoralizing when you start noticing that this may not be the storybook romance that you were looking for.
And if what Linda told her friends about Eric's abuse is true, could that ultimately explain her disappearance?
Abusers almost never start their abuse off on 10. More likely than not, boundaries are tested and pushed progressively over time, and then the escalation of violence.
For a victim of domestic violence, trying to get out of a relationship is the most dangerous time.
The aggressor or perpetrator of domestic violence is always struggling with some degree of control. When you're in a situation where you're feeling rejected by the person that you feel that you have control over, they do whatever is necessary to regain that control.
Is that what happened in Linda's case?
When Eric initially sat down with detectives, he had suspicious scratches on his hands.
He said he was sanding the floor for some unknown reason.
But now that more than a week has gone by with no word from Linda or leads on her whereabouts, detectives aren't so sure.
Perhaps this was not a missing persons investigation after all.
This smells like a homicide.
Hoping for more information about Eric and Linda's relationship, detectives return to her neighborhood and start knocking on doors.
Talking to Linda's neighbors, police learn a very important piece of information.
Excuse me, ma'am.
They spoke with a neighbor who was certain that she'd seen Linda getting into Eric's car on Thanksgiving Day.
You're certain it was Thanksgiving?
Positive. I was expecting family. So when I heard a car pull up outside, I looked out to see if it was them.
And you're sure it was Linda and Eric?
Definitely.
This is in direct contradiction to what Eric has said.
Eric had told police and told Linda's family that he had not seen her in some time.
The neighbor says that when she saw Linda get in the car with Eric that afternoon, she assumed they were heading across the Bay Bridge to San Francisco.
She told her neighbors that she was excited, looking forward to spending Thanksgiving at her mother's house.
Instead, that was the last time anyone had seen Linda.
Armed with this new information, investigators began to take a closer look at Eric.
They were eventually able to get a search warrant for Eric's home in the Oakland Hills.
Question is, after 4 weeks, will they even find anything?
As we all know, that means forensic evidence is far harder to come by.
Despite that, the search does raise questions.
There was a carpet that was missing. There was furniture that was missing or had been moved around.
And as he'd said when detectives asked about the scratches on his hands, it appeared that Eric had been sanding his floors.
It didn't look like he was remodeling.
The floor was sanded in a very rushed, messy, incomplete way.
It looks like someone had attempted to clean up a potential crime scene.
Suspecting that's the case, detectives decide to take a closer look.
They call in the crime scene investigators, who come in with their technology.
One of the first things the CSI techs do is spray the walls around the sanded area with luminol.
Luminol under fluorescent light will reveal where bloodstains were previously cleaned.
And in this case, it appeared to confirm that the detectives were dealing with a homicide.
They find traces of blood splatter on the wall of Eric's home.
More than a month after Linda Alonzo mysteriously disappeared, Oakland police have found their first clear indication that she may have been murdered.
When they searched Eric's upscale home in Oakland Hills, they discovered blood spattered on the walls.
And according to a neighbor, they last saw Linda getting into Eric's car on Thanksgiving Day, just a few hours before she went missing.
Eric told investigators that he hadn't seen Linda for 4 days leading up to Thanksgiving.
However, they will need more to make an arrest.
The CSI team took samples of the blood on the walls of Eric's house.
They then send them to the lab for analysis.
When they will get the results is anyone's guess.
Back in this point in time, DNA took a number of weeks, up to months, to process before the police department would get back the results.
Several months go by before detectives finally get the evidence they need.
The DNA test discovered that the blood on Eric's wall was a match for Linda.
There was enough forensic evidence based on those lab results that they were able to get an arrest warrant.
But when they go to make the arrest, detectives hit another snag.
Eric wasn't at home.
In fact, the fancy house in the Oakland Hills that Linda had been so impressed with wasn't even his anymore.
He had sold it and apparently skipped town.
Was he on the run? Was he just taking a trip? Nobody knew.
Months go by without any sign of their suspect or any evidence indicating where he'd gone.
Eric dropped completely off the radar.
It's not until February of 2007, more than 2 years after Linda went missing, that detectives finally get a tip that Eric has been spotted.
They located their person of interest on the Jack London waterfront, right here in Oakland.
They were able to bring him in for questioning.
This time, when investigators talked to Eric, it wasn't as pleasant as the first time. They didn't consider him to be the doting boyfriend who had stood by Linda during all her life's challenges. Instead, police investigators confronted him with the evidence.
We found Linda's blood at your house. I can explain that.
He said that someone had broken into his house in the middle of the night.
About a month before Linda's disappearance.
Eric claims Linda surprised the intruder, and he pistol whipped her before fleeing the scene.
So all of that blood and all that stuff must have been from the home invasion.
The detectives are skeptical.
This was the first time Eric had ever said anything about a home invasion.
They confronted Eric with the testimony that the neighbors saw Eric and Linda together as Linda was getting into his car on Thanksgiving.
It wasn't me, I swear.
He claimed he didn't know where Linda was. He hadn't seen Linda, and he did not kill her.
Then why'd you leave town? I had to.
His answer was that he was in fear for his life, that Linda's family was threatening him, that they believed, mistakenly, he said, that he was somehow involved in her disappearance, and he was afraid that they were going to hurt him.
I had to leave town.
He seems to have an answer and a story for everything.
Not that detectives are buying any of it.
It's pretty clear that Eric is the killer.
Glenn, stand up.
At the end of the interview, they booked him on murder charges.
However, the police and prosecutors know they are a long way from a murder conviction.
The case against Eric was fairly circumstantial at this point.
Physical evidence is everything.
And there's one major piece of evidence that's still missing.
There wasn't a body.
Not having a body is very challenging for a prosecutor. One of the biggest pieces of a case is how was the person killed? And if you don't have a body, you're not going to know what happened to her.
But what if there was someone who knew the truth?
While Eric was in jail, a friend of Linda's family was also in lockup at that time.
That friend got in contact with the detectives.
Get your hands off of me!
Red is still on me.
Police in Oakland, California have built a strong circumstantial case that Eric Mora murdered his missing girlfriend, Linda Alonzo.
They found Linda's blood inside of his house, and friends said it was an abusive relationship.
Most of all, a neighbor had seen Linda get into Eric's car just hours before she went missing.
That directly contradicted the story that Eric had tried to feed to the investigators.
But without a confession or Linda's body, a conviction was far from assured.
Any prosecutor you talk to will tell you that it is extremely hard without a body.
But before the case goes to trial, the detectives catch a lucky break.
They're contacted by a jailhouse informant who said that Eric offered to pay him money to back up his story.
Eric offered this person $1,000 if he would back up Eric's claims that Linda had left home prior to Thanksgiving, that Linda was on the streets, and that Eric had nothing to do with it.
But instead of testifying for Eric, he'd gone straight to detectives.
This informant was a friend of her family. He wanted to get all of this information and find out what really happened.
He never actually said anything about him actually murdering her. I don't remember anything concrete, but he alluded to the fact that she was dead.
All the informant knew was that Linda's body wasn't anywhere around Eric's house.
He's like, I'm not that secret.
And according to the informant, Eric never said exactly why he'd killed her.
I said, how did he put it? That they got into some type of spat or something.
It's as close to a confession as the detectives are likely to get.
But prosecutors knew it was far from a slam dunk case.
When the case goes to trial in 2012, the prosecution theorizes that Eric and Linda's spat started when she told him the relationship was over.
What do you mean we're done?
I don't want to be with you no more. I just want to be free. I'm done.
In that moment, he's losing control. It makes sense that he may snap. He may see red.
Get your hands off of me.
So in an act to exert that control over her, he resorted to violence.
Get your hands off of me.
But since the prosecutors don't have Linda's body, or know precisely how Eric killed her, will their theory of how the crime occurred convince the jury?
When a jury listened to the inconsistencies in Eric's statements, the DNA and the blood splatter in his home, the witness testimony that said that the last time that Linda was saw alive was with Eric, a jury of his peers convicted him for the murder.
The judge sentences Eric to 15 years to life in prison.
But the story wasn't over. Eric appealed this conviction.
Ultimately, the court overturns his conviction in 2016.
They concluded that the trial judge had wrongfully barred the defense from bringing forward any other suspects.
When a conviction is overturned, prosecutors have the option of moving forward with the new trial. And that's always extremely difficult.
But the prosecutors won't need to go back to trial.
More than a decade after Linda's disappearance, Eric was ready to come clean for a price.
He wanted to cut a deal. He told prosecutors that he would confess to the crimes if they would give him a sweetheart deal. 11 years in exchange for telling them where they could find her body.
Despite the drastic reduction in sentence, the prosecutors make the deal.
Is it worthwhile to offer them a much lesser sentence for retrieval of the body? In most cases, the answer to that is yes. That closure aspect of it is, that's key.
Although what Eric tells them provides little comfort for Linda's family.
He said that after the murder, he wrapped Linda's body in a tarp and buried her in a shallow grave on the grounds of the decommissioned Oakland Army base.
It's a fairly desolate industrial area in Oakland, not that far from the freeway.
Detectives organize an extensive search for Linda's remains. But after weeks of painstaking effort, they come up empty-handed.
And they were unable to give the family closure or Linda the proper burial she deserved.
The fact that prosecutors allowed Eric's plea deal to stand only added to the family's disappointment.
He could be up for parole in 2025 and back out there. This is someone who killed his girlfriend of 2 years, the mother of 5 children.
But in May of 2022, just as the family is losing hope that Linda will ever be found, a construction crew working on the old Army base makes a shocking discovery.
They stumbled upon a shallow grave that contained a body.
It looked like Eric may have told the truth, after all.
Forensic testing confirms the body is that of Linda Alonzo.
It took 18 years, but Linda is no longer missing.
There isn't a word for this combination of relief and sadness that I'm sure the friends and family felt when the body was found. On one hand, their hope that she might still be alive is gone, but there's the relief of being able to finally put her to rest.
I'm hopeful that it has brought them a sense of peace that they did not otherwise have.
Abuse is never okay. If you or someone you love is in an abusive relationship, there is help available. Call.
The air in Los Angeles on February 23, 2018, carried a kind of tired warmth, the sort that clings to the city even when the sun begins to fall behind the low skyline. Hollywood did not sleep, but it always seemed to exhale at night, releasing the pressure of another day filled with auditions, broken promises, and people chasing versions of themselves that might never exist. On that evening, in a modest apartment complex tucked somewhere in the dense sprawl of Hollywood, a young woman prepared to leave behind the last place she had called home. Her name was Adia Shabani. She was 25 years old. To the outside world, She was one of thousands who arrived in Los Angeles carrying nothing more than a suitcase, a dream, and the belief that somewhere among the endless casting calls and closed doors, there might be a moment where everything finally made sense. She had come from Macedonia, leaving behind a country where her name was known only to family and friends, and stepping into a city where no one knew it at all. That anonymity can feel like freedom at first. Later, it can feel like being erased while you are still alive. That afternoon, Adia was seen packing her belongings. Not everything she owned, just enough to suggest she would be away for a short time. Clothes folded with care, personal items placed into bags that would soon become evidence rather than travel accessories. There was nothing unusual in the way she moved through the apartment. No sudden urgency. No visible fear. Just the quiet rhythm of someone preparing for a trip. Outside, the city continued its indifferent pulse. Cars passed. Neighbors came and went. Somewhere nearby, someone rehearsed lines for an audition that might never come. Hollywood has a way of making private lives feel temporary, as if everyone is simply passing through each other's stories. At some point that afternoon, Adia met with Christopher Spots. He was not a stranger to her world. He was part of it, woven into her recent life in a way that blurred the lines between companionship and uncertainty. Their relationship, according to later accounts, was not simple. It carried weight, complications, and contradictions that would only become clearer in hindsight. To those who knew them loosely, it may have looked like just another Hollywood relationship, intense and unstable in the way that young, ambitious lives often are in a city built on reinvention. But what happened next would turn that relationship into the center of a criminal investigation. Security footage captured the moment Adia left her apartment. She stepped into view carrying her belongings. There was nothing theatrical about her movements. No hesitation that cameras could detect. Just a young woman walking toward what she believed was a ride, a meeting, a continuation of her day. Beside her was Christopher Spots. The two of them moved together with the familiarity of people who had shared time, arguments, and silence. Then they disappeared from the frame. That was the last confirmed moment in which Adia Shabani was seen alive. In the hours that followed, there was no immediate alarm. No dramatic signal that something had gone wrong. At first, it looked like absence. The kind of absence that happens often in a city like Los Angeles, where people go off the grid for auditions, trips, or impulsive decisions to disconnect from everything. But as the hours turned into days, and days turned into something heavier, those who knew Adia began to feel a different kind of silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that presses against the mind and refuses to lift. Her family, far away in Macedonia, began trying to reach her. Messages went unanswered. Calls did not connect to a familiar voice. Friends in Los Angeles began comparing notes, trying to reconstruct her last known movements. The city that once felt full of opportunity began to feel like a maze with no center. Somewhere in that growing gap of uncertainty, Christopher Spots became a focal point. When investigators eventually began to piece together the timeline, his explanation emerged as an attempt to fill the silence. He described a road trip north, away from Los Angeles, away from routine, toward open roads that stretched into Northern California. According to his account, there had been an argument along the way. Emotions escalated. The kind of conflict that, in his telling, reached a breaking point in Santa Clarita. And then, he said, he had left her there. On the side of the road. Alone. It was a statement that should have provided clarity. Instead, it created more questions than answers. There was no physical evidence to support the idea that Adia had simply vanished from a roadside stop. No witnesses came forward to confirm seeing her. No surveillance footage placed her walking away from that location. The road itself, examined through the lens of investigators, offered nothing that aligned with the simplicity of that explanation. And so the story began to shift. What initially looked like a missing person case began to take on the shape of something more serious. Detectives started to look not just at where Adia had gone, but at who had been with her when she disappeared. Patterns emerged in Spot's statements. Small inconsistencies. Changes in detail. The kind of subtle fractures that often appear when a narrative is constructed after the fact rather than lived in real time. The deeper investigators looked, the more the absence of Adia began to feel intentional rather than accidental. Then came another detail that changed the temperature of the case entirely. Christopher Spots could not be located. He was no longer cooperating. No longer answering questions. No longer staying within the boundaries of a known address. In investigative work, absence can speak as loudly as presence. A person who disappears while being sought in connection with a missing individual does not simply fade away. They create momentum in a different direction. At this point, Adia's case stopped being about a missing actress. It became about pursuit. While investigators worked to reconstruct every known hour of Adia's final day, another parallel search began for Spots. Detectives followed digital traces, vehicle movements, and fragmented sightings reported too late to be fully reliable. Each new lead seemed to dissolve under scrutiny, leaving behind only the outline of a man moving just ahead of the system trying to find him. And still, Adia remained missing. Days stretched into weeks. In Hollywood, life continued as if untouched. Auditions were held. Scripts were read. Lights were set up in studios where people pretended to be someone else for a living. But beneath that surface, there was a growing unease among those who had known Adia. A feeling that something irreversible had already happened, even if no one could yet prove it. Her apartment stood still in time. Her belongings waited in places she had left them. Her phone no longer rang. The digital trace of her presence began to thin, not because she had chosen silence, but because silence had been forced upon her. Then, in late March, the case changed again. A discovery in Northern California would break the ambiguity of missingness and replace it with something far more final. But at this stage of the investigation, no one yet knew that the story of Adia Shabani had already crossed a point of no return. All they knew was that a young woman had walked out of her apartment in Hollywood, gotten into a car with someone she trusted, and disappeared into a city that rarely returns what it takes. And somewhere in that silence, a truth was waiting to be uncovered, piece by piece, in a way that would leave no one unchanged. The city of Los Angeles has a way of rewriting itself depending on who is looking at it. To tourists, it is a place of sunlight and palm trees, of Hollywood signs and endless possibility, a city built on the illusion that anyone can become someone else. To those who live inside its machinery, it is something more complicated. A layered structure of ambition, exhaustion, and invisible competition, where every street corner seems to hold a conversation that started before you arrived and will continue long after you leave. In early 2018, Hollywood was already deep in its familiar rhythm of reinvention. Casting directors were moving between projects. Young actors were shifting from one audition to another, carrying headshots that might never be looked at twice. Coffee shops around Sunset Boulevard were filled with people rehearsing monologues under their breath, trying to turn nervous energy into something that resembled confidence. It was a place where hope and disappointment often shared the same seat at the same table. Adia Shabani had entered this environment like so many others, but with a distance that made her presence slightly different. She was not born into this city. She had chosen it. That choice mattered, because in Los Angeles, choice is often mistaken for control, even when the outcome is far beyond anyone's influence. She had come from Macedonia with the quiet determination that defines so many who arrive in America's entertainment capital. Her background was not one of privilege or established connections. It was built on persistence, on the belief that talent alone might be enough to open doors that often remain locked to those without the right introductions. She enrolled in acting classes, attended auditions, and began assembling the fragile early structure of a career that existed more in potential than in reality. Those who met her in those early years described her in simple terms that carried more weight than they initially seemed to. Focused, soft-spoken, polite in a way that suggested discipline rather than hesitation. She was someone who listened carefully, who observed more than she spoke, as if she were constantly collecting fragments of behavior, emotion, and expression that might later be used in performance. But beneath that surface, there was always the underlying tension that defines life in Hollywood for people like her. The tension between what is visible and what is promised. Every day in the city presents a subtle question. How long are you willing to wait for something that may never arrive? For Adia, the answer seemed to be measured in effort rather than certainty. She continued to work. She continued to audition. She continued to build relationships within a community that was itself transient, where friendships often formed quickly and dissolved just as fast, shaped by casting calls, relocations, and shifting opportunities. Her life was not isolated, but it was also not anchored. It floated in the same space as many others in Los Angeles, connected but not fully secured. In this environment, personal relationships often become complicated extensions of professional instability. The boundaries between trust, dependency, and emotional necessity blur in ways that are difficult to define from the outside. Adia's connection with Christopher Spotts existed within this blurred space. To understand the atmosphere surrounding them, it is important to understand how relationships in Hollywood often develop under pressure. People meet in acting classes, on set, at auditions, or through mutual acquaintances who are themselves uncertain about their own futures. Time is compressed. Emotional intensity increases. Decisions are made quickly, sometimes without the foundation that would normally stabilize them elsewhere. What may appear from the outside as stability is often something more fragile underneath. Adia and Spotts were part of this ecosystem. They were seen together often enough that their connection was not hidden, but not so consistently that it appeared fully defined. To those around them, they were simply another couple navigating the uncertain terrain of early careers and shifting personal circumstances. There were moments of closeness, moments of distance, and moments where the relationship seemed to exist more as a question than an answer. In Los Angeles, that is not unusual. But what makes certain relationships significant in hindsight is not how they appear in ordinary moments, but how they behave under pressure. On February 23, 2018, pressure entered their story in a way that would later become irreversible. That morning and afternoon unfolded without public awareness of what was building beneath it. Adia continued her day in the same city where millions of people move through invisible turning points, without anyone noticing. She was preparing to leave her apartment, a space that reflected her life at that time, temporary, practical, and filled with the subtle markers of someone still in transition. Clothing meant for auditions, personal items arranged with care, reminders of a life that had not yet fully stabilized. Outside, the light was typical for Los Angeles in late winter. Not cold enough to slow the city, not warm enough to create comfort. Just a neutral atmosphere in which events can unfold without drawing attention to themselves. At some point, she and Christopher Spotts came together. The exact sequence of their meeting that day would later become part of the investigative timeline, reconstructed through footage, statements, and fragmented accounts. What is clear is that they left together. Security cameras captured their departure. The image was ordinary at first glance. Two people walking with belongings, moving through a familiar space, stepping into what appeared to be a continuation of an already established plan. There was no visible struggle. No indication, within the limited frame of a camera, that anything unusual was taking place. Just movement. Direction. Exit. The absence of dramatic signals in that moment is what makes it so difficult to revisit. Because nothing about it suggested finality. Los Angeles is full of departures that look exactly like that. People leaving apartments with bags. People getting into cars. People heading toward auditions, trips, or temporary escapes from routine. The city is built on motion, and motion rarely announces its consequences in advance. But in Adia's case, that motion marked the beginning of disappearance. After she left that frame, the world continued as it always does. Phones rang. Messages were sent. Notifications appeared on screens that would later become silent. Time moved forward without acknowledging that something had changed its direction. In the hours that followed, there was no immediate alarm. Not because people did not care, but because absence is often misinterpreted in a place where disappearance is not uncommon. In Hollywood, silence can mean many things: a spontaneous trip, a busy schedule, a phone turned off during an audition, or a temporary withdrawal from the constant demand of connection. But as time stretched, silence began to take on weight. Family members attempted to reach her. Friends checked messages that remained unanswered. Small concerns began to accumulate, each one adding a layer to a growing sense that something was not aligning correctly. The absence was no longer ordinary. It was becoming structured, persistent, and resistant to explanation. And somewhere within that growing structure of uncertainty, the city continued to function as if nothing had changed. Auditions were still held. Traffic still moved. Conversations still unfolded in cafes and apartments across Hollywood. The machinery of entertainment did not pause for individual disappearance. It rarely does. Yet for those closest to Adia, the world had already shifted. They did not yet know the full shape of what had happened, but they could feel its outline forming in the space she had left behind. And in that outline, one question began to emerge with increasing clarity. Where had she gone after stepping out of that camera frame with Christopher Spots? The answer, still hidden at this stage, would eventually transform uncertainty into something far more concrete. But for now, all that remained was a young woman from Macedonia, a city built on dreams, a departure captured on surveillance, and a silence that was beginning to feel less like absence and more like a warning that something irreversible had already begun. The first hours after Adia Shabani's disappearance did not feel, to those around her, like the beginning of a criminal investigation. They felt like a delay. A temporary disruption in communication that might still resolve itself with a phone call, a message, or an explanation that would reframe everything as a misunderstanding. In a city like Los Angeles, where schedules shift constantly and people often vanish from one another's lives for reasons that are rarely dramatic, absence is usually interpreted with caution rather than alarm. But as time stretched forward, that interpretation began to fail. Adia Shabani was not someone who typically disappeared from her own life. Those who knew her described a pattern of presence that was consistent, even if her circumstances were still evolving. She responded to messages. She maintained contact with her family across continents. She stayed engaged with her acting classes and professional opportunities, even when progress was slow. Her life, while not fully stable, still had a visible rhythm to it. And rhythm, once broken, is difficult to ignore. The silence that followed February 23rd did not resemble her. At first, friends tried to explain it away. Perhaps she was traveling. Perhaps she had taken a spontaneous trip with Christopher Spots, something unplanned, but not necessarily alarming. In Hollywood, impulsive decisions are not unusual. People leave for days without telling others, especially when emotional pressure builds around auditions, relationships, or career setbacks. It is a city that normalizes disappearance at a small scale. But this silence did not behave like the usual kind. It did not lift. It deepened. Messages remained unread. Calls went unanswered. Social media accounts that once showed signs of life fell still. Each passing hour added weight to what might otherwise have been dismissed. And as that weight accumulated, concern began to replace assumption. Her friends started comparing timelines. They tried to reconstruct the last time anyone had spoken to her in a meaningful way. Small details became important. A tone in a message. A mention of plans. A reference to meeting someone. In the absence of certainty, memory becomes investigative material. And Christopher Spots, who had last been seen with her, became the unavoidable center of that reconstruction. In cases of disappearance, relationships often become the first lens through which investigators and acquaintances interpret uncertainty. Not because they automatically imply guilt, but because they define proximity. Who had access? Who had time? Who had the last confirmed interaction? In Adia's situation, Spots occupied that critical position. But proximity alone is not evidence. It is only a starting point. As concern grew among those who knew her, attempts were made to reach him. At first, these efforts were informal, driven by friends who simply wanted clarity. They asked questions. They looked for reassurance. They tried to understand what had happened after the two of them left the apartment together. What they encountered instead was distance. Spot's explanations, when they came, did not resolve uncertainty. He spoke of travel, of movement northward, of an argument that escalated during what he described as a road trip. In his version of events, emotions had flared in Santa Clarita, a location that would later become a key point of reference in the investigation. He claimed that Adia had been left there after the argument, and that they had separated. On the surface, the story had structure. It had geography. It had a sequence of events that could, in theory, be mapped onto real locations. But structure is not the same as credibility. When investigators later examined his statements, what stood out was not what he said, but what was missing around what he said. There were gaps in detail. Shifts in phrasing. Changes in emphasis that made the narrative feel less like a memory and more like a reconstruction. The kind of story built after the fact, shaped by pressure rather than recollection. And more importantly, there was nothing to confirm it externally. No witnesses in Santa Clarita, who could reliably place Adia there under those circumstances. No surveillance footage that aligned with the timeline described. No supporting digital trail that reinforced the idea of a simple drop-off followed by separation. In the absence of confirmation, doubt begins to expand. Meanwhile, Adia's family, far away in Macedonia, began to experience the disappearance not as uncertainty, but as emotional rupture. Distance transforms missing persons cases in a particular way. When loved ones are across the world, there is no physical space in which to search. Only communication channels that remain stubbornly inactive. Messages sent across oceans that do not return answers. For them, time moved differently. Each day without contact was not just absence but escalation. A growing sense that something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed by patience alone. In Los Angeles, friends and acquaintances continued to search for patterns. They revisited conversations, reread messages, and tried to identify anything that might explain the break in contact. Some began to feel a sense of unease that they could not fully articulate. Not fear yet, but something close to it. The feeling that a normal explanation was becoming less and less likely. It is often in this stage of a disappearance that emotional perception begins to separate from official classification. For the people inside the situation, something feels wrong. For institutions, however, thresholds must be met. Evidence must accumulate. Time must pass before a case is formally elevated. Adia's case existed in that gap. Not fully urgent in the eyes of the system, but increasingly urgent in the minds of those connected to her. And at the center of that gap stood Christopher Spotts, whose movements were becoming harder to track. The uncertainty surrounding him added a different texture to the situation. It was no longer just about where Adia was. It was also about where he was not. His absence from normal points of contact began to raise its own questions. In investigations, a person who disappears while being linked to a missing individual becomes part of the narrative, whether or not they initially were intended to be. Still, at this stage, nothing was confirmed. Only patterns were forming. Only silence was expanding. Only distance was increasing between what was known and what was real. And somewhere within that expanding distance, Adia Shabani remained unreachable, suspended in a timeline that had stopped producing answers the moment she stepped out of her apartment and into a car that would take her away from every point of certainty she had left. The investigation into Adia Shabani's disappearance began in the way many missing persons cases begin in Los Angeles. Slowly, cautiously, and initially without the full weight of urgency that would later define it. At first, it was classified as concern rather than certainty, a situation that required attention, but not yet the full machinery of a homicide investigation. In a city where people frequently leave without explanation, where reinvention is almost a cultural expectation, the absence of a young actress was troubling, but not immediately extraordinary. That perception would not last. As detectives began to formally assemble the timeline of February 23, 2018, the simplicity of the early narrative started to fracture. What had first appeared as a possible voluntary disappearance, or a temporary separation from routine, began to reveal inconsistencies that could not be easily dismissed. Each verified detail tightened the space around uncertainty, reducing the number of plausible explanations. The last confirmed image of Adia was already known, her leaving her apartment in Hollywood with Christopher Spotts. But what investigators now needed to understand was not just where she had gone, but how the situation had evolved after that moment, and whether the explanation provided later by Spotts could withstand scrutiny. According to his account, the two had embarked on a road trip northward. It was a narrative that, on its surface, fit within the realm of possibility. Young couples often travel impulsively, especially in environments where financial instability and emotional volatility intersect. But when detectives began examining the details more closely, the story began to feel less like a memory and more like a constructed framework designed to explain absence rather than describe events. The first point of friction came from geography. Santa Clarita, the location where Spotts claimed the argument occurred, became a focal point of verification. Investigators attempted to place both individuals there using surveillance systems, phone records, and potential eyewitness accounts. In modern investigations, movement is rarely invisible. Phones ping towers. Vehicles pass cameras. Transactions leave timestamps. Yet in this case, the expected digital footprint did not align cleanly with the narrative being presented. There were gaps where continuity should have existed. These gaps did not immediately prove wrongdoing, but they shifted the tone of the investigation. What had been a search for a missing person now began to include a parallel effort to evaluate the credibility of the last known companion. As detectives revisited the apartment footage, they studied not only the moment of departure, but everything surrounding it. The body language appeared ordinary. There was no visible struggle, no sign of overt distress captured by the camera's limited perspective. But investigators understood that surveillance is inherently incomplete. It captures movement, not intention. It records presence, not emotion. Still, it confirmed one critical fact. Adia left with Spots willingly, or at least without visible resistance. From there, the question became what happened after willingness ended, or whether something else entirely had already taken place. Friends and acquaintances of Adia began providing additional context. They described her as someone who was ambitious, but cautious, engaged in the difficult process of building a career in a highly competitive environment. She was not known for sudden disappearance or withdrawal from communication. That consistency made the silence after February 23 increasingly difficult to interpret as anything benign. At the same time, concern about Spots grew as attempts to locate or communicate with him became increasingly difficult. In investigations like this, absence becomes its own kind of signal. A person who should be reachable, but is not, raises questions that extend beyond simple explanation. Detectives began to treat his movements as a separate thread within the larger case. The emotional landscape surrounding Adia's disappearance also began to shift. What started as confusion among friends evolved into fear. Fear, in investigative contexts, often emerges not from what is known, but from what refuses to become known. The longer a person remains missing without explanation, the more the imagination fills in the silence with possibilities that grow increasingly severe. By the time the first formal investigative assessments were being compiled, the case had already moved beyond the boundaries of a routine missing persons report. Patterns in behavior, inconsistencies in narrative, and lack of corroborating evidence were converging into something more complex. Still, nothing definitive had been found. No body. No confirmed crime scene. No direct evidence of harm. Only absence, and the growing weight of unanswered questions. Detectives continued to reconstruct Adia's final known hours with precision. Every confirmed detail was mapped against potential movement paths. The goal was not only to locate her, but to determine whether she had ever left the control of the last person seen with her in a way that could be verified independently. In parallel, attention increasingly focused on Spots' explanation. The claim that he had left Adia on the side of the road in Santa Clarita was examined through both logistical and behavioral lenses. Investigators asked whether such an action made sense within the context of the journey he described, whether it aligned with known distances, and whether it matched patterns of behavior observed in similar cases. What they found was not confirmation, but fragmentation. The story did not hold together under pressure. And in investigative work, stories that do not hold together often point toward truths that have not yet been revealed. As this process unfolded, Adia's family continued to exist in a state of suspended distress. For them, the absence of information was not just an investigative challenge, but a lived reality. Every day without contact reinforced the possibility that something irreversible had occurred, even if no official conclusion had been reached. In Los Angeles, meanwhile, life continued in its usual rhythm, indifferent to the growing urgency beneath the surface of one unfolding case. The city does not pause for individual tragedies. It absorbs them, temporarily, before moving on to the next cycle of attention. But within the investigative team, attention was narrowing rather than dispersing. The case was no longer about whether Adia had simply disappeared. It was becoming about what sequence of events could explain her last known movement, and whether the person who was with her at that moment could provide any truthful clarity about what followed. At this stage of the investigation, certainty had not yet arrived. But doubt had already established itself firmly, and once doubt takes hold in a missing persons case, it begins to reshape every subsequent interpretation of evidence. What remained now was the need for something definitive. A trace. A location. A confirmation. Anything that could transform uncertainty into fact. Until then, the disappearance of Adia Shabani remained suspended in a tense equilibrium between what was known and what was feared, with Christopher Spotts positioned at the center of an investigation that was slowly, but unmistakably, tightening around the unanswered space he had left behind. The discovery phase of Adia Shabani's case began not with a dramatic breakthrough, but with something far more unsettling: absence made visible. On March 27, 2018, more than a month after she was last seen leaving her Hollywood apartment, investigators received confirmation that would permanently change the direction of the case. A body had been found in a remote area of Northern California, in the Spencerville Wildlife Area. The location was isolated, surrounded by dry terrain and sparse vegetation, far removed from the dense urban environment where Adia's life had last been documented. It was not a place where someone would normally end up by accident. It was a place chosen for distance, concealment, and time. The moment the report came in, the tone of the investigation shifted instantly. What had been a missing persons case, defined by uncertainty and procedural caution, now carried the weight of a presumed homicide investigation. Detectives, who had been tracing fragmented movements across Los Angeles and beyond, were now faced with the possibility that the answers they were searching for had already been buried, both literally and figuratively, for weeks. The process of identification was handled with clinical precision, but behind that procedure lay a quiet emotional gravity. The body was not immediately recognizable in a conventional sense due to decomposition, but investigators were able to confirm identity through distinctive markings, including tattoos that matched those documented in prior records. Those small personal details, once part of her identity as a young actress building a life in Hollywood, now served a different purpose. They were proof of continuity between the living person who had disappeared and the remains that had been found. For those working the case, there is always a moment like this that marks a psychological threshold. Before identification, there is still space for possibility, however thin. After identification, that space collapses. Adia Shabani was no longer missing in the abstract sense. She was confirmed deceased. The location where she was found deepened the gravity of that realization. Spencerville Wildlife Area is not a place of incidental concealment. It is remote, quiet, and intentionally removed from the rhythms of daily human activity. Reaching it requires intent, familiarity with geography, and a willingness to travel far beyond populated corridors. The distance from Hollywood, roughly hundreds of kilometers, suggested deliberate transportation rather than spontaneous movement. This detail alone forced investigators to reconsider earlier assumptions about the timeline and the level of control involved in her disappearance. Once the identification was confirmed, forensic examination became the next critical step. The condition of the remains, along with environmental factors, provided investigators with limited but important information. Time of death could not be pinpointed with absolute precision, but it was clear that Adia had not survived long after she was last seen. The gap between disappearance and discovery now formed a dark corridor of unknown events, a period in which only one certainty existed: she had been killed. The cause of death, determined through forensic analysis, was blunt force trauma to the head. This conclusion transformed the nature of the case entirely. It removed ambiguity about whether her death had been accidental or self-inflicted. It confirmed external violence, the involvement of another person, and a deliberate act that ended her life. In investigative terms, this is the point where a case transitions from uncertainty into classification. It becomes a homicide investigation, and every previous detail is reinterpreted through that lens. The focus immediately returned to the last confirmed companion, Christopher Spotts. Up to this point, Spotts had been a person of interest primarily due to proximity and inconsistent statements. Now, he became the central figure of a murder investigation. Detectives revisited his account with renewed scrutiny, comparing his explanation of events against the physical reality emerging from forensic findings. His claim that he had left Adia on the side of a road in Santa Clarita now appeared increasingly incompatible with the evidence. The distance between that location and the discovery site in Northern California raised immediate logistical questions. The timeline between disappearance and death, as inferred from forensic estimation, did not support a prolonged period of independent survival after the alleged roadside separation. Each new detail narrowed the range of plausible scenarios. As investigators built a more coherent timeline, they also expanded their search for spots. At this stage, locating him was no longer simply a matter of gathering testimony. It was a matter of determining accountability, understanding sequence, and potentially preventing further loss of information that might be critical to reconstructing the final hours of Adia's life. But before that process could fully unfold, another development occurred that altered the trajectory of the case in a way no one had anticipated. Christopher Spotts could no longer be located. His disappearance from the investigative map introduced a new layer of complexity. In many cases, when a suspect vanishes during a homicide investigation, it signals a shift from cooperation to evasion. Detectives began tracking his movements with urgency, reviewing surveillance, travel patterns, and any possible sightings reported in the days following Adia's disappearance. What they found was fragmented movement rather than a clear path. A pattern of avoidance rather than destination. Each attempted lead seemed to dissolve just as it was approached, leaving behind only traces that suggested someone actively staying ahead of detection. This parallel disappearance created a dual narrative within the investigation. One centered on the confirmed death of Adia Shabani, and the other on the absence of the last known person seen with her alive. As law enforcement intensified its efforts, the emotional impact on Adia's family and friends deepened. The confirmation of her death ended one form of uncertainty, but replaced it with another, more final form of grief. There was no longer hope of finding her alive, but there was still the unresolved question of how and why her life had been taken. In Los Angeles, the city where she had been pursuing her dreams, the contrast between everyday life and investigative reality became more pronounced. Studios continued to operate. Auditions continued to be held. The machinery of entertainment did not slow down. But for those connected to Adia, every ordinary moment now existed alongside the knowledge of what had been discovered far away. Investigators, meanwhile, were left with a case that had shifted into its most critical phase. A confirmed homicide. A suspect who had vanished. A timeline that required reconstruction across multiple jurisdictions. And a set of unanswered questions that now carried legal and human weight. The discovery of Adia Shabani's body did not close the case. It opened it fully. Because now, the question was no longer where she was. It was what happened between the last moment she was seen walking out of her apartment in Hollywood and the moment her body was found hidden in the remote landscape of Northern California, a journey that suggested intention, concealment, and a sequence of events that investigators were only beginning to understand. The investigation into Adia Shabani's disappearance entered its most psychologically complex phase in the days after she was officially reported missing. At this point, the case was no longer about establishing whether something unusual had happened. It was about determining intent, reconstructing fragmented truth, and separating coincidence from behavior that might indicate responsibility. Detectives often describe this stage of an investigation as the moment when the story stops being linear. Every piece of information becomes multilayered. Every statement must be examined not only for what it says, but for what it avoids saying. And in Adia's case, the center of that interpretive pressure remained Christopher Spotts. He had been the last confirmed person seen with her. That fact alone placed him under immediate scrutiny, but in investigative work, proximity is only the beginning of analysis. What matters next is consistency, corroboration, and the ability to independently verify movement. As detectives began building a structured timeline, they first focused on reconstructing Adia's final known hours with precision. Surveillance footage confirmed her departure from her Hollywood apartment with spots. That moment was no longer just a piece of narrative, it became an anchor point in time. Everything before it was context. Everything after it was uncertainty. The next step was to trace what could be independently confirmed beyond that exit. This is where the investigation began to strain against gaps. Spot's account introduced a sequence of events that included travel outside Los Angeles, a dispute, and a separation in Santa Clarita. On paper, the structure seemed coherent. In practice, it lacked the kind of external validation investigators rely on. There were no witnesses who could reliably place Adia in that location at the time described. No surveillance systems that clearly supported continuous movement along the claimed route. No consistent digital trace that matched the narrative without interruption. What emerged instead was fragmentation. And fragmentation, in investigative terms, is rarely neutral. It signals either incomplete memory or constructed explanation. As detectives compared phone records, vehicle data, and available location points, they noticed that the expected continuity of movement was not present. Modern life leaves trails even in short journeys, cell tower pings, time-stamped activity, incidental recordings. But in this case, there were intervals where expected data simply did not align with the story being told. These absences did not immediately prove wrongdoing, but they changed the investigative temperature. What had once been treated as a missing person case, with an uncertain outcome, was now being examined as a potential homicide with a focus on reconstruction of intent. At the same time, investigators began speaking more extensively with people who knew Adia personally. Friends, classmates, and acquaintances provided a portrait of a young woman who was ambitious, structured in her habits, and consistent in her communication. She was not described as someone who would disengage suddenly from all contact without explanation. That consistency became important, not as emotional testimony, but as behavioral baseline. When someone deviates from established patterns, investigators look for external causes rather than internal withdrawal. Her acting instructors described her as diligent. Not the loudest presence in the room, but attentive, careful, and committed to improvement. She was building a career in an environment where uncertainty is the norm, yet she maintained routines that suggested forward planning rather than instability. That behavioral stability contrasted sharply with the sudden silence that followed February 23. Meanwhile, attention toward Spots intensified in parallel. Detectives attempted to verify his movements independently, but encountered increasing difficulty locating him. At first, this was treated as potential non-cooperation. People under pressure sometimes withdraw from contact without immediate implication of guilt. But as time passed, his absence became more difficult to categorize as passive behavior. He was no longer simply unresponsive. He was no longer consistently traceable. He was, in practical terms, becoming absent from the investigative map. This created a second line of inquiry, not only what happened to Adia, but where the last known companion had gone during the critical period after her disappearance. In investigative psychology, this dual absence often becomes significant. When a key witness or suspect disappears while a missing person case is still active, it complicates the reconstruction process and raises questions about control of narrative. Detectives expanded their search across jurisdictions, reviewing possible travel corridors and attempting to locate any trace of Spot's movements. What they found was not a clear trajectory, but intermittent signs of avoidance, movements that did not form a stable pattern of residence or predictable location. At this stage, investigators also revisited the original explanation provided by Spots regarding the alleged roadside separation. They analyzed whether such an event would realistically produce the lack of evidence observed in the case. The absence of corroborating witnesses, combined with inconsistencies in timing, made the explanation increasingly difficult to sustain as a complete account. However, investigators were careful not to prematurely conclude intent. In homicide investigations, premature certainty can distort interpretation of later evidence. Instead, they focused on narrowing possibilities. Each layer of verification reduced the number of viable scenarios. As the structure of the case tightened, emotional weight increased among those closest to Adia. Her family, receiving limited information across international distance, experienced the investigation not as procedural development, but as prolonged uncertainty transitioning into fear. Every update, or lack thereof, carried disproportionate emotional impact, because it was filtered through distance and lack of direct access to the investigation's physical environment. In Los Angeles, the entertainment industry continued its rhythm, largely unaware of the investigative shift occurring beneath the surface of a missing actress case. Auditions, rehearsals, and production schedules continued uninterrupted. The city's external stability contrasted sharply with the internal urgency of the case. For detectives, however, the case was no longer defined by ambiguity. It was defined by narrowing space. Adia's disappearance was no longer an isolated event without context. It was becoming a sequence with missing segments that needed to be reconstructed through forensic, digital, and behavioral evidence. And at the center of that reconstruction remained a critical question that had not yet been answered definitively: what occurred in the transition between her leaving a Hollywood apartment and the moment she was no longer alive? A transition now confirmed through discovery, but not yet fully understood in its human or chronological detail. The investigation was moving toward clarity, but it had not yet reached it. What it had achieved instead was focus. And in cases like this, focus is often the point where everything begins to converge toward resolution, even if that resolution is still hidden behind layers of absence, contradiction, and silence. The turning point in Adia Shabani's case did not arrive with a single dramatic revelation, but rather through a convergence of investigative pressure, behavioral analysis, and the gradual collapse of uncertainty around the actions of Christopher Spotts. It was the moment when suspicions stopped being theoretical and began to take on the structure of something that could be actively pursued. Before this phase, the investigation had been defined by absence, a missing woman, incomplete timelines, and fragmented explanations. Now, it began to shift toward presence in a different sense, the presence of patterns, contradictions, and decisions that could be interpreted as deliberate attempts to control narrative and distance. Detectives had already established the core framework. Adia was last seen leaving her Hollywood apartment with Spotts. That fact was no longer under debate. What remained in question was everything that happened after that shared departure. The investigative focus narrowed to a critical window of time, one in which both individuals were unaccounted for in a verifiable way. It is within these gaps that breakthroughs often occur, not through new evidence appearing suddenly, but through old evidence being reinterpreted under stricter scrutiny. Spotts' account of a road trip and an argument in Santa Clarita had initially been recorded as a working hypothesis. But as investigators revisited each element, they began to identify inconsistencies that were difficult to reconcile with physical and digital evidence. The absence of corroborating surveillance along the claimed route became more significant with each review. In modern urban and suburban corridors, movement is rarely invisible. Vehicles pass cameras. Phones connect to towers. Transactions leave timestamps. Yet in this case, continuity was missing where it should have been naturally present. That absence began to feel less like coincidence and more like structure. At the same time, behavioral analysis became an increasingly important tool in understanding the situation. Investigators examined Spotts' communication patterns, his willingness or unwillingness to remain in contact, and his responsiveness to informal outreach from those trying to locate Adia. What emerged was a pattern of avoidance rather than engagement. Not a single decisive action, but a gradual withdrawal from points of contact that would normally exist in a cooperative scenario. This type of behavior does not automatically indicate guilt, but in the context of a missing person case, it raises operational concern. When combined with inconsistencies in narrative, it becomes part of a cumulative profile that investigators cannot ignore. As pressure increased, the investigative team expanded its efforts to locate spots. At first, this was framed as a need for clarification. His statements, after all, were central to understanding Adia's last movements. But as days passed without reliable contact, the purpose of locating him shifted. It was no longer only about clarification. It was about accountability and containment of uncertainty. Detectives worked through available channels, attempting to reconstruct his post-disappearance movements. Financial activity, known associations, possible travel routes, and any incidental sightings were all reviewed. What they found was not a clean escape or clearly defined relocation, but something more ambiguous. A pattern of instability in location, marked by intermittent traceability, and increasing difficulty in establishing current whereabouts. This ambiguity complicated the investigation further. A missing person case was now intertwined with the search for a key individual who was himself becoming difficult to locate. The dual absence created a feedback loop of uncertainty, where each unanswered question reinforced the urgency of the next. Within this environment, Adia's family continued to push for answers from a distance that made the situation even more emotionally destabilizing. For them, updates were not procedural milestones. They were fragments of reality that arrived slowly, without the grounding context of the investigation's physical progression. The confirmation of her death, when it eventually came, transformed their experience from uncertainty into grief, but did not resolve the underlying need for explanation. In Los Angeles, investigators faced a different kind of pressure. Their task was no longer to find a missing person, but to reconstruct a sequence of events that had already concluded in violence. The discovery of Adia's body in Northern California had already established homicide as the operative classification. Now the focus narrowed further toward causation and responsibility. The central question became increasingly defined: what happened between the moment Adia left her apartment in Hollywood and the moment her body was concealed in a remote wildlife area hundreds of kilometers away? To answer that, detectives revisited every known point in the timeline with renewed intensity. Even previously dismissed inconsistencies were re-examined. Small deviations in timing, minor contradictions in statements, and gaps in digital records were reassessed as potential indicators of direction rather than noise. In parallel, forensic findings provided structural boundaries for the investigation. The cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head, confirmed external violence and eliminated ambiguity regarding accident or self-infliction. This allowed investigators to refine their focus toward interaction and mechanism rather than speculation about cause. With this foundation in place, the investigative team began constructing a more coherent model of events. While not yet legally conclusive, this model suggested that Adia's disappearance and death were not separate incidents, but parts of a continuous sequence involving controlled movement and deliberate action. Spot's increasing absence from contact points became more significant within this framework. In investigative terms, absence after central involvement often transforms from circumstantial detail into behavioral indicator. It suggests either avoidance, fear, or an attempt to evade procedural contact. While none of these alone confirm criminal responsibility, together they form a pattern that investigators are trained to recognize as potentially meaningful. As the pressure intensified, law enforcement agencies escalated coordination efforts across jurisdictions. The geographical spread of the case, from Hollywood to Northern California and beyond, required synchronized tracking and information sharing. Each agency contributed fragments of data, building a composite picture that gradually reduced the space of uncertainty. Yet even as clarity increased around Adia's fate, the location of Spots remained unresolved. That unresolved element prevented the case from reaching closure, keeping it in a state of active pursuit. This stage of an investigation is often the most demanding, because it requires holding two realities at once, one where a victim has been confirmed, and another where a central figure remains unaccounted for, potentially carrying answers that have not yet been spoken or recovered. For the investigators, the breakthrough was not a single moment of revelation, but the realization that the remaining unknowns were no longer evenly distributed. They were converging around one individual, one timeline, and one sequence of decisions that had not yet been fully explained. And as that convergence tightened, the case moved into its most critical phase, where resolution was no longer a distant possibility, but an approaching necessity shaped by evidence that continued to accumulate, even in the absence of its central witness. The legal resolution of Adia Shabani's case unfolded in a way that defied the traditional structure of courtroom justice. There was no trial in the conventional sense, no jury weighing testimony, no defense attorney challenging the prosecution's narrative in open court. Instead, the case moved toward closure through a combination of forensic certainty, investigative convergence, and an absence that reshaped the entire meaning of accountability. By the time authorities confirmed the identity of Adia's remains and established homicide as the cause of death, the focus of the justice system had already begun to shift away from prosecution and toward reconstruction. In most cases, the courtroom becomes the space where truth is contested and formalized. In this case, that space was replaced by investigative reports, forensic findings, and interagency documentation that collectively formed the final narrative. Christopher Spots, the last known person seen with Adia alive, was already no longer in custody and no longer available for legal proceedings. His death by self-inflicted gunshot wound, during a police pursuit, removed the possibility of a conventional trial. That fact fundamentally altered the trajectory of justice. The system could no longer ask him direct questions. It could no longer test his statements under oath. It could only interpret the evidence left behind and attempt to assemble a coherent understanding of what had occurred. In the absence of a defendant, the role of the justice system shifts. It becomes less about adjudication and more about confirmation. Less about determining guilt in a courtroom, and more about establishing factual certainty through evidence that can withstand institutional scrutiny. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's findings became central to that process. The determination of blunt force trauma as the cause of death provided a definitive medical conclusion that eliminated ambiguity. It confirmed that Adia's death was the result of external violence, not accident, not natural causes, and not self-inflicted harm. This finding carried legal weight even in the absence of a trial, because it established the foundational classification of the case as homicide. From that point forward, every investigative conclusion was built upon that classification. Law enforcement agencies compiled their findings into a comprehensive case file that documented the timeline, behavioral analysis, forensic evidence, and geographic movement associated with both Adia and Spots. This file served as the closest equivalent to a courtroom record, even though it would never be tested in front of a jury. It represented the institutional memory of the case, a structured attempt to preserve truth in the absence of formal adjudication. One of the most significant challenges in this phase was reconciling the lack of direct confrontation with the need for narrative closure. In traditional trials, opposing sides present competing interpretations of events. The truth emerges through contradiction and resolution. Here, there was no opposing narrative being actively defended in court. There was only the investigative reconstruction, shaped by evidence and constrained by what could be verified. This created a unique form of legal and emotional tension. For investigators, the absence of trial did not diminish the importance of accuracy. If anything, it increased it. Without judicial examination, the responsibility of ensuring factual integrity rested entirely on the investigative record. As the case file was finalized, attention turned toward public communication. Law enforcement agencies issued formal statements summarizing the outcome of the investigation. These statements emphasized the confirmed facts. Adia Shabani had been killed. Her body had been discovered in a remote area of Northern California, and the last known individual seen with her had died during a police pursuit before he could be apprehended or tried. These public disclosures served multiple purposes. They provided official closure to the public record, they clarified the status of the investigation, and they acknowledged the limitations imposed by the absence of a living suspect. At the same time, they reinforced the idea that justice in this case would not be delivered through courtroom verdicts, but through the establishment of truth within the evidentiary record. For Adia's family, however, the legal resolution did not equate to emotional resolution. The confirmation of her death and the circumstances surrounding it created a finality that was both necessary and devastating. They were no longer waiting for news of her return, but they were still left without the possibility of hearing her voice, seeing her again, or receiving direct explanation of what had occurred in her final hours. In cases where a suspect dies before trial, families often face a complicated form of grief. There is closure in knowing what happened, but there is also an absence of accountability in the traditional sense. There is no courtroom confrontation, no sentencing, no public reckoning that unfolds through judicial procedure. The narrative ends in evidence rather than judgment. In Los Angeles, the case gradually transitioned from active investigation to historical record. Detectives moved on to other assignments, but the documentation remained, preserved within the system as a completed homicide investigation with identified cause, probable perpetrator, and established timeline. Yet even as the case formally closed within institutional boundaries, it continued to exist in a different form within the minds of those who worked it. Investigators often retain cases like this in memory not because of procedural complexity alone, but because of the human weight embedded in the evidence. A young woman who arrived in a city built on dreams, last seen stepping out of her apartment with someone she trusted, never returning alive. A sequence of decisions that led from ordinary movement to irreversible outcome. The absence of a courtroom trial also left certain questions permanently unanswered. While evidence strongly supported the investigative conclusion regarding responsibility, the inability to examine Spot's account under legal scrutiny meant that some aspects of intent and subjective experience remained untested. The system could reconstruct events, but it could not interrogate motive in the way a trial might have allowed. This is one of the inherent limitations of justice systems when cases end outside the courtroom. The truth can be established to a high degree of certainty, but the adversarial process that typically refines that truth is no longer available. Despite this limitation, the case achieved what it could within its constraints. Adia Shabani's death was officially recognized as a homicide, her identity confirmed, her final movements reconstructed to the extent possible, and the individual last seen with her accounted for within the investigative narrative, even if not through judicial sentencing. Over time, the case became part of a broader pattern of investigations involving missing persons in urban environments where transient populations, complex relationships, and limited early reporting can delay resolution. It served as a reminder of how quickly disappearance can escalate into tragedy, and how fragile the boundary is between ordinary movement and irreversible outcome. For those closest to Adia, the passage of time did not diminish the significance of what happened. Instead, it gradually transformed the form of memory. What remained was not only the investigative conclusion, but the image of a young woman building a life in a city that promised opportunity, while often delivering uncertainty. The courtroom, in its traditional sense, never became the final stage of this case. Instead, the final judgment was written in reports, forensic analysis, and investigative consensus. It was a form of justice defined not by confrontation, but by reconstruction. And in that reconstruction, one fact remained unchanged from beginning to end. Adia Shabani had walked out of her apartment in Hollywood with the expectation of continuing her life, and she never returned. In the aftermath of Adia Shabani's case, what remained was not the momentum of investigation, or the structure of legal procedure, but something quieter and more enduring. It was the kind of silence that follows resolution, when resolution arrives without the usual architecture of justice, without courtroom confrontation, and without the public ritual of a verdict being spoken aloud. The facts had been established. The timeline had been reconstructed. The outcome had been classified. Yet what lingered was the human residue that no report could fully contain. For those who had followed the case from the beginning, there was a strange emotional imbalance in the ending. The investigation had reached clarity, but clarity did not behave like closure. It did not resolve grief. It did not simplify memory. Instead, it created a fixed point around which unanswered emotional questions continued to orbit. Adia Shabani's life, as it was understood after the investigation, became something defined by two contrasting images. The first was the young woman arriving in Los Angeles, carrying ambition shaped by distance, stepping into a city built on performance and reinvention. The second was the final reconstruction of her last known hours, a sequence of movements that ended in disappearance and violence, far from the environment where she had been trying to build her future. Between those two images lay the space where interpretations struggled to fully settle. For her family, the aftermath was not defined by investigative language or legal classification. It was defined by absence that had changed form. At first, it had been the absence of communication, then the absence of location, and finally the absence of life itself. After confirmation, absence became permanence. There was no longer the possibility of return, no ambiguity left to hold on to. What remained was memory without continuation. In cases like this, families often describe a particular kind of temporal disorientation. The world continues moving forward, but emotionally, time becomes segmented into before and after. Before disappearance. After confirmation. Before knowledge. After truth. Yet even truth, when delivered through investigation rather than personal explanation, does not always integrate smoothly into emotional understanding. For Adia's loved ones, there was also the added complexity of distance. The geography between Macedonia and Los Angeles meant that much of the investigative process unfolded without physical presence. Updates arrived through communication channels rather than direct participation. This separation intensified the feeling that the case belonged to two different realities, one procedural and documented, the other emotional and lived. In Los Angeles, the city where Adia had been pursuing her career, life continued in its usual rhythm. Hollywood did not pause to reflect on individual tragedies for long. The entertainment industry, with its constant cycle of auditions, productions, and turnover, moved forward as it always does, absorbing stories without stopping its own momentum. Yet for those who had known her personally, the contrast between the city's ongoing motion and her permanent absence created a lasting emotional dissonance. Friends and acquaintances were left with fragmented memories that now carried new weight. Conversations that once seemed ordinary became points of retrospective analysis. Small details that had gone unnoticed during her life became significant only after her death. This is one of the quiet consequences of unresolved trauma that becomes resolved too late. The human mind reconstructs meaning after the fact, searching for signals that were never visible in real time. The presence of Christopher Spotts in the narrative also left behind a complex psychological imprint. As a central figure in the investigation, his actions and eventual disappearance from the legal process became part of the case's unresolved emotional structure. His death before trial removed the possibility of public testimony, explanation, or confrontation within a courtroom setting. This absence of direct accountability created a gap in the narrative that no amount of investigative certainty could fully fill. In many criminal cases, the courtroom serves as a space where conflicting interpretations of events are tested and resolved. Without that process, the story remains anchored in evidence rather than dialogue. Evidence can establish what happened, but it cannot always fully explore why it happened in a way that satisfies emotional understanding. That distinction became particularly visible in this case. The investigative findings had been clear. Adia had been killed. The cause had been determined. The sequence of events had been reconstructed to the extent possible. Yet the internal human questions that often follow violent loss remained untouched by procedural completion. What did not emerge from the investigation was a fully accessible narrative of intent in the way a trial might have provided. While evidence strongly supported conclusions about responsibility and sequence, the absence of adversarial examination meant that certain psychological dimensions remained outside formal exploration. This is not unusual in cases where suspects die before trial, but it leaves behind a particular kind of narrative incompleteness. Over time, the case became part of a broader pattern studied by investigators and analysts who focus on missing persons in urban environments. It highlighted how quickly relationships can become central to investigative direction, how rapidly disappearance can transition into homicide classification, and how critical early communication gaps can shape the entire trajectory of a case. But beyond institutional analysis, the case also remained a human story shaped by vulnerability and proximity. Adia's position, as a young woman navigating an unfamiliar industry in a foreign country, added layers of complexity to how her disappearance was later understood. She was not only an individual case file. She was also part of a larger demographic reality of people who move across borders in pursuit of opportunity, entering environments where social support systems may be limited and where personal relationships can carry heightened influence. The emotional aftermath also extended into reflections on perception versus reality. From the outside, Los Angeles often represents possibility. It is a city associated with success stories, visibility, and transformation. But within that same environment, countless individuals experience instability, uncertainty, and isolation. Adia's story, when viewed through this lens, became part of a broader conversation about the gap between expectation and lived experience in highly competitive urban spaces. For those who worked the case, the long-term psychological impact was quieter, but still present. Investigators often carry cases like this not as active assignments, but as structured memories of events that cannot be fully separated from their professional identity. The image of a timeline reconstructed from fragments, the knowledge of a life ended in violence, and the absence of a trial all remain part of that internal record. As years pass, cases like this are no longer defined by urgency. They become defined by permanence. The facts do not change. The conclusions do not shift. What evolves instead is the way those facts are carried emotionally by those who encountered them during the investigative process. In reflecting on the case of Adia Shabani, what ultimately remains is not only the investigative conclusion, but the awareness of how fragile the boundary is between ordinary life and irreversible outcome. A young woman leaves her apartment in Hollywood expecting continuity. She steps into a moment that appears routine. The city continues moving. The world continues functioning. And yet, within that continuity, a sequence has already begun that will not return her to the life she left behind. The aftermath of her case does not offer resolution in the emotional sense. It offers understanding without comfort. Structure without restoration. It is a reminder that investigative closure and human closure are not the same thing, and that even when a case is considered complete within the justice system, the emotional landscape it leaves behind remains open in ways that time alone does not fully close. In the end, what lingers is not the mechanics of the investigation, but the absence of return. The absence of voice. The absence of continuation. And within that absence, the story of Adia Shabani remains, not as an unsolved mystery, but as a resolved tragedy, whose emotional weight continues to exist long after the final report has been filed, long after the investigation has ended, and long after the city of Los Angeles has moved on to its next unfolding story. There is a kind of silence that follows a completed investigation that feels different from the silence of uncertainty. It is not the silence of not knowing. It is the silence of knowing too much, and still being left with questions that cannot be answered in the same way anymore. In the case of Adia Shabani, that silence settled slowly, almost imperceptibly, into the space left behind by urgency. The case file had been closed in an administrative sense. The conclusions had been recorded. The narrative had been constructed from evidence, forensic findings, and reconstructed timelines. Yet the human dimension of the case continued to exist outside of those boundaries, resisting finality in the way that certain stories always do when they involve sudden absence. In the months that followed, attention within law enforcement naturally shifted to other cases. This is the rhythm of investigative work. One case resolves, another opens, and the system moves forward because it must. But certain investigations remain present in institutional memory longer than others, not because of procedural complexity alone, but because of the emotional and narrative weight they carry. Adia's case was one of those. It was not the only missing persons case to result in a homicide classification. It was not the only case where a suspect died before trial. But it carried a particular combination of elements that made it difficult to fully compartmentalize. A young immigrant building a life in Hollywood, a relationship that became central to investigative direction, and a disappearance that unfolded in a city accustomed to both visibility and erasure. Over time, the case became a reference point in discussions about investigative timelines and behavioral interpretation. Analysts examined how quickly suspicion had formed around Christopher Spotts, and how that suspicion evolved into structured investigative focus. They looked at the gaps in his narrative, the inconsistencies in movement, and the eventual convergence of forensic evidence that confirmed homicide. Not as isolated facts, but as part of a broader pattern that reflected how modern investigations are shaped by both digital traceability and human behavior. One of the most discussed aspects of the case was the speed at which proximity turned into centrality. In many missing persons investigations, the last known companion is often a starting point, not a conclusion. In Adia's case, that starting point quickly became the core axis of the entire investigation. This raised questions among professionals about how early interpretive framing can influence the direction of investigative resources, even when such framing is justified by evidence. Another point of reflection was the role of absence as evidence. Christopher Spotts' disappearance during the investigative phase was not, in itself, proof of wrongdoing. But it contributed to a pattern of behavior that investigators could not ignore. In modern policing, absence is rarely neutral when it occurs alongside unresolved violent outcomes. It becomes part of the interpretive field, shaping probability assessments and investigative priorities. Yet even with all of this analysis, the case remained, at its core, fundamentally human rather than procedural. For those outside the investigative system, the story of Adia Shabani became something else entirely. It became a narrative about vulnerability in transitional spaces. About how people who move across countries to pursue creative ambitions often enter environments where emotional, financial, and social stability are still being constructed. Hollywood, in particular, functions as both a destination and a filter. It attracts ambition while simultaneously exposing fragility. Adia's presence in that environment reflected a broader reality experienced by many young performers who arrive with expectations shaped by cultural mythology. The idea that talent alone will eventually translate into opportunity. The belief that persistence will be rewarded in visible form. The assumption that proximity to the industry equals access to it. Her life in Los Angeles, as reconstructed through friends and acquaintances, was not defined by tragedy before her disappearance. It was defined by effort, routine, and gradual progress within a system that rarely moves quickly. She attended classes, pursued auditions, and navigated the uncertainty that defines early-stage artistic careers. There was nothing in her established behavior that suggested sudden withdrawal or disappearance as a voluntary act. This behavioral consistency became one of the quiet, but important elements of the investigation. Not because it provided direct evidence, but because it helped define what was unusual about the moment she vanished. Investigators rely heavily on patterns, and disruption of pattern is often one of the earliest indicators that something external has occurred. In the years following the case, discussions about Adia's disappearance occasionally resurfaced in media coverage of similar incidents. Not in sensationalized form, but in reflective analysis about how missing persons cases unfold in urban environments where population density, anonymity, and mobility can both help and hinder investigations. Her case also became part of training discussions in certain investigative contexts, particularly around the importance of early timeline reconstruction and the interpretation of inconsistent statements. The discrepancies in Christopher Spott's account were studied not as isolated contradictions, but as examples of how narrative instability can signal deeper structural issues within a suspect's explanation of events. However, even within these professional discussions, there was an acknowledgement that no amount of analytical clarity can fully resolve the emotional dimension of such cases. The transition from missing person to confirmed homicide always leaves behind a psychological residue that exists outside of documentation. For Adia's family, that residue became permanent. The investigation provided answers, but those answers did not replace the person who had been lost. They did not restore the continuity of communication or presence that had been broken. Instead, they created a fixed point in time where everything changed, and everything after that point was defined in relation to absence. This is one of the most difficult aspects of resolved cases involving death. Closure is often procedural, not emotional. It exists in reports, not in lived experience. In Los Angeles, the physical spaces connected to Adia's life gradually returned to normal use. Buildings changed occupants. Streets remained the same. The apartment complex, where she was last seen, continued to function as part of the city's constant cycle of movement. The environment did not retain memory in any visible way. Cities rarely do. And yet, within investigative archives and personal memory, the case remained fixed. The final reflection that often emerges from cases like this is not about the mechanics of investigation, but about the fragility of assumed continuity. A person leaves home, engages in a routine interaction, and steps into a sequence of events that cannot be reversed. From the outside, nothing appears immediately different. From the inside, everything has already changed. In the end, the story of Adia Shabani does not conclude with a dramatic revelation or a moment of confrontation. It concludes with reconstruction, with evidence assembled after the fact, with a narrative built from fragments that could no longer be tested through direct testimony. What remains is a case that is complete in structure, but not in emotional resolution. A story that has been fully investigated, but not fully reconciled in the human sense. And that distinction is what defines its lasting presence, the difference between what is known and what can never again be experienced. In the final reflections on the case of Adia Shabani, what remains is not a single moment of resolution, but a layered understanding of how disappearance, investigation, and reconstruction intersect in ways that rarely align with emotional expectations. Even when a case is considered fully investigated, it does not necessarily mean it is fully resolved in the human sense. It simply means that the available evidence has been organized into a coherent structure, that can be preserved within institutional memory. For investigators, the closing of the case file marked the end of active pursuit. The timeline had been established, the cause of death confirmed, and the primary person of interest identified through forensic and circumstantial convergence. There was no longer a procedural requirement for further action. Yet cases like this do not end cleanly within the minds of those who worked them. They remain present in fragmented ways, resurfacing not as active files, but as reconstructed sequences that retain emotional and analytical weight. The final investigative conclusion centered on a sequence that began with a departure from a Hollywood apartment and ended with the discovery of remains in a remote area of Northern California. Between those 2 points lay a reconstructed narrative supported by surveillance footage, digital analysis, behavioral interpretation, and forensic evidence. Within that structure, Christopher Spotts was identified as the last known individual with Adia before her disappearance, and as the central figure connected to the circumstances surrounding her death. However, the absence of a formal trial created a unique boundary in how the case could be publicly and legally understood. In most homicide investigations, the courtroom serves as the space where evidence is tested under adversarial conditions. It is where competing interpretations are examined, and where legal responsibility is formally assigned. In this case, that stage never occurred. The death of Spotts, during a police pursuit, removed the possibility of judicial examination, leaving the investigative record as the final authoritative account. This absence of trial does not diminish the strength of the evidence, but it does change the nature of closure. Without cross-examination, without testimony under oath, and without judicial sentencing, the narrative remains anchored in reconstruction rather than adjudication. It is complete in structure, but not in procedural resolution. Over time, this distinction became an important point of reflection for those who study cases involving missing persons and untested outcomes. The Adia Shabani case illustrates how modern investigations can reach high levels of certainty through forensic and digital means, yet still remain outside the traditional courtroom framework that defines legal closure. One of the most significant aspects of the case, from an analytical perspective, is how quickly it transitioned from disappearance to homicide classification once physical evidence was discovered. The identification of blunt force trauma as the cause of death provided the decisive shift from uncertainty to confirmation of external violence. This forensic finding established the foundational truth upon which all subsequent investigative conclusions were built. But even with that clarity, the emotional landscape of the case remained unresolved for those personally connected to it. Families of victims in such cases often experience a form of closure that is procedural rather than experimental. They receive answers about what happened, but not restoration of what was lost. The distinction between knowledge and healing becomes particularly pronounced in cases where legal proceedings do not occur. For Adia's family, the confirmation of her death marked the end of hope for return, but not the end of emotional processing. The investigation provided explanation, but explanation does not function as substitution for presence. What remained was the necessity of adapting to a reality defined by permanence of absence. In Los Angeles, the environment in which Adia had been building her career continued its uninterrupted cycle. The entertainment industry, shaped by constant movement and turnover, rarely pauses for individual cases unless they become part of broader cultural discourse. Over time, her story became one among many that illustrate both the promise and vulnerability inherent in pursuing artistic ambition within a highly competitive urban landscape. Yet even as the city moved forward, the investigative record preserved her case in detail. Within that record, her life was not defined solely by its ending. It was also documented through her presence in acting classes, her efforts to establish herself professionally, and her relationships within a community that was itself transient and evolving. These details matter because they restore individuality to a narrative that could otherwise be reduced to a single outcome. The figure of Christopher Spotts remains central to any understanding of the case, not because of narrative emphasis alone, but because of his structural position within the timeline. As the last confirmed person seen with ADR live, his actions and statements became critical reference points for reconstruction. His disappearance during the investigative process and subsequent death removed the possibility of direct clarification, leaving interpretation dependent entirely on external evidence. This absence of direct testimony is one of the defining characteristics of the case. It forces reliance on indirect indicators, surveillance footage, digital traces, forensic results, and behavioral patterns. Each of these elements contributes to a composite understanding, but none can fully replace the clarity that direct explanation under oath might have provided. Despite this limitation, the investigative conclusions remain stable. The convergence of evidence supports a consistent narrative of events leading from departure in Hollywood to fatal injury and eventual concealment of remains in a remote location. Within that narrative, the role of Spotts is established through proximity, behavior, and circumstantial alignment with forensic findings. However, the broader significance of the case extends beyond its specific individuals. It reflects systemic realities about how missing persons cases are handled in large urban environments, how quickly investigative focus can narrow based on proximity, and how digital and forensic tools now play a central role in reconstructing events that would previously have remained ambiguous. It also highlights the emotional asymmetry between institutional closure and personal grief. For the justice system, closure is defined by completion of investigation and documentation of findings. For families and communities, closure is an ongoing process that does not align with procedural timelines. In reflecting on the case of Adia Shabani, the final understanding is not confined to the mechanics of investigation. It extends into the recognition that some cases achieve resolution only within systems, not within human experience. The difference between those two forms of resolution is what gives the case its lasting weight. What remains, ultimately, is a reconstructed truth supported by evidence, a confirmed sequence of events established through investigation, and an absence that continues to exist beyond the boundaries of official closure. The story does not end with uncertainty, but it does not fully end with peace either. It ends in documentation, in memory, and in the persistent awareness that some conclusions, while complete on paper, remain incomplete in the ways that matter most to those who lived closest to the loss. In the years following the formal conclusion of the investigation into Adia Shabani's death, the case gradually transitioned from active institutional record into something more reflective, almost analytical in nature. It became part of a broader conversation within investigative communities, not because it remained unsolved, but because it represented a convergence of modern forensic certainty and emotional incompleteness. The facts were known. The sequence had been reconstructed. Yet the case continued to be examined, not for what was missing in evidence, but for what it revealed about the structure of disappearance itself. Within law enforcement circles, the case was often discussed in terms of timeline compression and behavioral convergence. The speed at which suspicion formed around Christopher Spotts was seen as a textbook example of how proximity, inconsistency, and absence can combine to shape investigative direction. What began as a missing persons report evolved rapidly into a homicide investigation once physical evidence was discovered. That transition was not unusual in itself, but the clarity of the forensic findings made it a particularly clean example of how modern investigative systems operate when digital and physical evidence align. The discovery of Adia's remains in the Spencerville Wildlife Area remained one of the most critical structural points in the case. That location, remote and deliberately concealed, reinforced the conclusion that her body had been transported with intent to obscure discovery. For analysts, this detail was not merely geographic. It was behavioral evidence expressed through environment. The distance from Hollywood, the lack of incidental discovery, and the nature of concealment all contributed to a unified interpretation of deliberate action following death. In this context, the case of Adia Shabani became a reference point for discussions about post-event concealment behavior in homicide investigations. The emphasis was not on speculation, but on pattern recognition. Investigators studied how movement after death often reflects decision-making processes that are distinct from the act of violence itself. In Adia's case, the separation between the location of last sighting and the location of recovery created a spatial narrative that required intentional coordination. Another aspect that continued to be analyzed was the role of narrative construction in the early stages of the investigation. Christopher Spott's explanation of events, particularly the claim of a roadside separation after an argument, became a case study in how suspect statements are evaluated against independent verification. What stood out was not only the absence of corroborating evidence, but the structural instability of the narrative when placed against digital and geographic constraints. Modern investigations rely heavily on the assumption that movement leaves traces. Cell tower data, surveillance systems, and incidental digital interactions form a lattice of verification points. In this case, those points did not align with the account provided. The gaps were not dramatic individually, but collectively they formed a pattern that suggested selective reconstruction rather than continuous memory. This is where the case became particularly significant for training and academic discussion. It illustrated how inconsistency does not need to be overtly contradictory to be meaningful. Subtle misalignments in timing, location, and sequence can accumulate into a structural breakdown of credibility when examined across multiple independent systems of verification. Yet even with this analytical clarity, the case remained emotionally resistant to full abstraction. One of the reasons it continued to be discussed beyond procedural contexts was because of the human profile at its center. Adia was not a figure defined by criminal association or high-risk environment. She was a young immigrant pursuing an acting career in a highly competitive industry, navigating the early stages of professional development in a city known for both opportunity and instability. That contrast between expectation and outcome contributed to the enduring emotional weight of the case. It disrupted the assumption that violence is always preceded by visible escalation. In many cases, including this one, the transition from ordinary interaction to irreversible outcome occurs without external warning signs that are easily recognizable in real time. From a sociological perspective, the case also highlighted the complexity of relational dynamics in transitional environments. Los Angeles, particularly within entertainment and creative communities, is a space where personal and professional boundaries frequently overlap. Relationships often form quickly under conditions of shared ambition and uncertainty. These environments do not inherently produce violence, but they can complicate the interpretation of interpersonal signals when situations escalate. In reviewing the case, some analysts noted how early interpretations of Adia's disappearance were shaped by assumptions about voluntary absence, a common initial hypothesis in urban missing persons cases. This assumption is not unique to this case, but it reflects a broader investigative challenge, distinguishing between voluntary disengagement and external interference in environments where both are statistically plausible. What ultimately shifted the interpretation in this case was not speculation, but convergence of evidence. The identification of blunt force trauma as the cause of death removed ambiguity regarding mechanism. The recovery location reinforced the conclusion of post-event transportation. The behavioral inconsistencies in the primary person of interest's account added structural pressure to the emerging narrative. Each element alone was suggestive, but together they formed a cohesive reconstruction. Despite this clarity, the absence of a judicial trial continued to define how the case exists in public and institutional memory. Without courtroom proceedings, there was no adversarial testing of evidence in a formal setting. No cross-examination. No public presentation of competing interpretations under oath. The investigative conclusion stands as authoritative, but it exists outside the experimental framework of legal adjudication. This distinction is important because it shapes how closure is understood. In most homicide cases that proceed to trial, closure is distributed across multiple stages: investigation, prosecution, verdict, and sentencing. In this case, closure occurred at the investigative level. That does not reduce its validity, but it changes its texture. For those who study unresolved emotional impact in closed cases, this difference is significant. It illustrates how institutional closure does not always align with psychological closure. Families, communities, and even investigators may continue to process events long after official documentation is complete. In the broader context of missing persons investigations, Adia's case is frequently referenced in discussions about early-stage information asymmetry. The first hours and days of a disappearance are often the most critical, yet also the most uncertain. Initial assumptions can influence resource allocation, investigative direction, and public perception. Once a narrative begins to form, it can be difficult to reshape without strong contradictory evidence. The case also serves as an example of how modern forensic systems have changed investigative outcomes. In earlier decades, gaps in witness testimony or incomplete timelines might have left significant ambiguity. In this case, digital and forensic convergence allowed investigators to construct a relatively stable narrative despite the absence of a living suspect for trial. Still, even with technological precision, there are limits to reconstruction. The internal experiences of those involved, the precise sequence of decisions in real time, and the subjective motivations behind actions remain partially inaccessible. Investigations can establish what happened and when it likely occurred, but not always fully capture the internal logic that led to each decision point. This is where the case retains its enduring complexity. It exists simultaneously as a completed investigation and as a partially inaccessible human narrative. No further legal action remains possible. No additional procedural steps are pending. Yet the interpretive space around the case continues to exist in analytical, emotional, and educational contexts. In the final assessment, the significance of Adia's case is not found only in its conclusion, but in its structure. It demonstrates how disappearance can transition rapidly into confirmed homicide when evidence aligns, how behavioral inconsistencies can shape investigative focus, and how the absence of judicial proceedings can leave a case complete in record but open in reflection. And within that structure, the memory of Adia Shabani remains anchored not only in the facts of the investigation, but in the broader understanding of how fragile the boundary can be between ordinary movement and irreversible loss. The case is closed in documentation, but it continues to exist in analysis, in training, and in reflection, as a reminder that even when every available piece of evidence has been assembled into a coherent whole, the human dimension of a story does not always conclude at the same moment as its official record.